Our intention this evening is to have a conversation that will be insightful for both nonprofit leaders and for philanthropists, and we're thrilled to have representatives from both groups in our audience this evening. Ultimately, we want to encourage philanthropic partnerships that have meaningful impact. Fortunately for us, in an innovative state like Colorado, with a lot of innovative leaders, we have no shortage of philanthropists and nonprofits who are forging new ways to partner for maximum effect. After a few introductory remarks, I'll pose questions to our panelists who will introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions. So I'll ask you to hold your questions until that time, if you would. We'd like to thank Colorado Public Radio, who is our media sponsor this evening, and many of you who joined us because of your support and affiliation with Colorado Public Radio. Stuart Vanderwilt, CEO, and his staff who are here this evening, thank you very much. Stuart joined Colorado Public Radio in July of 2018 and has been leading public radio organizations for more than 3 decades. He works closely with CPR's board of directors, senior staff, and leadership team to fulfill the organization's mission and vision. And with that, let me turn it over to Stuart, who will say a few words.
Thank you so much, Jane. And I'm sorry I'm going to stand in front of you here for just a moment. I also want to thank Ben and Akasha and the Centrinsic team for all you do to support the financial health of nonprofits in Colorado, including, of course, Colorado Public Radio. Really appreciate the opportunity to share just a few remarks. So charity and philanthropy, I would say, are essential to the functioning of our society. Charity can be the lifeline to basic survival, the relief delivered to disaster-struck communities, the meal or blanket for a hungry or cold person, the lifelight to deliver a patient to the care they need, and the gift of time and effort to volunteer in the community is also an important act of charity. And in this great country, for some, charity remains essential for their daily survival. Philanthropy invests in solutions and is essential for our future. Breakthrough research, education, job creation. Philanthropy creates and invests in institutions that collect and share art and music, and to create and protect spaces to experience nature. We like to consider every donor a philanthropist, no matter the size of their investment, but sometimes, I'll say, our own processes get in our way. I'll tell you just a brief story. A listener attended the public portion of a CPR board meeting to share how important CPR is to her life, but also that as an organization, our systems discouraged her gift. After a divorce, she lost her home, was living in her car, and during that time, CPR News and Classical were her companion, her comfort, her source of information. And when a membership drive came along, she called to give us $5. As a portion of her disposable resources, this was a major gift, a very personal act of philanthropy. But we didn't have an easy way to accept it. She didn't have a permanent address or a credit card. We didn't know what to do with an offer of $5. And as such, we took away her joy of giving. And while this is an edge case, it is a critical reminder that philanthropy comes in many amounts, in many forms, and when given and received, should deliver joy to the donor and to the recipient. And for that, I want to thank all of you for being here, for doing what you do to strengthen our communities with your philanthropy, and for doing so with joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stuart. That's incredible. Thank you. Before I turn it over to our panelists who will introduce themselves, I'd like to provide a little bit of background on this beautiful building that we're in, because it goes with the theme of this evening's discussion. Centrinsic CEO Ben Valor-Kaplan, to my right, your left, and his partners acquired 3840 York Street with the express purpose of creating a space in the community that would bring together community members, nonprofit organizations, and socially engaged for-profit companies. Since being built as a medical depot for the U.S. Army in 1942, the building has a long history of service to the Army, Air Force, State of Colorado, City of Denver, Denver Public Schools, and most recently, Inner City Health Center. Centrinsic moved here at the end of 2018, and the ownership group has been actively seeking tenants who share their vision. The building is now home to Moonshot Adventures, the Globeville Alaria Swansea Coalition. Did I do that? Okay, thank you. Community Wealth Building Network, and several small businesses, most of which are women-owned. The building regularly hosts community gatherings to discuss housing, finance, healthcare, and tonight, philanthropy. So that's where we are in this space, which is, I think, very wonderful. So thank you for that. We have a great group of panelists for you this evening, each of whom brings unique perspective on philanthropy. You'll find their bios in your program, so we're not going to do long introductions. Instead, I'm going to ask each panelist to briefly introduce themselves and then discuss a major social issue that personally motivates each of them and explain why it resonates with them. I'm going to start with Ben, and I'm also going to just thank Ben and his staff who are here and team for organizing this wonderful and hosting this wonderful event tonight. It took a lot of work to bring all of this together, so thank you, Ben and team. We are grateful for that, and with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks. Welcome. It's awesome to have everyone here. And it's a little humbling because there's a lot of experience in the room. A lot of people committed to CPR. But also just a lot of people have been doing amazing work in the community for quite a while. By way of, so I'm Ben Valora-Kaplan, I'm the CEO of Centrinsic. And as we were thinking about the introductions, I was just reflecting on something that happened that might share some context about how I look at the world. 9/11 happened, obviously, a long time ago. And I was supposed to give a keynote address to a bunch of educators a week later at a conference. And everyone was definitely still dealing with anger, grief, mourning in many ways. It was a really emotional time. And I had to figure out what to say in front of 150, 200 people. And so I was also processing my own emotions around all of that. So I wrote a letter to my son, who was, 9 months old at the time, 10 months old. And the theme of that letter was create beauty. And I came up with that theme as sort of my way of trying to think about, well, so if stuff like this can happen in the world, what role do I want to play? What do you say to a child in response to something like this? And so I guess when I was thinking about what social issue kind of drives me, I think it's actually more that overarching theme of the different ways that we all strive, and most of the people in this room, most days, strive to create beauty in different ways, whether it's through the arts, through education, healthcare, environment, whatnot. So there you go. That's a little bit about me.
That was lovely. I'm Laura Barton, and it's my privilege to serve in the community as both a community volunteer and a philanthropist. And I think that probably my motivation overall, if you would think about, besides, of course, having an informed citizenry to preserve our democracy, which is something that I value, is really equity and access. And I think that that's an overarching umbrella to our investments in education, in healthcare, and in human services. But it's really about making sure that all of the people who live in our community have access to just the privileges and the opportunities that many of us in this room have. And I know so many of you work to that same goal.
Thanks, Laura. I'm Fred Taylor, and I'm president and co-founder of North Star Investment Advisors, and that's what I spend 50% of my time with. The other 50% of my time, as Laura knows, is primarily in the not-for-profit sector with Children's Hospital. I'm chair of that foundation board right now, and College Invest, and the Women's Foundation. We have a couple people from the Women's Foundation. My story is really watching my parents when I was a little boy, and they were giving back to the community, and my father would be going to Boys and Girls Clubs board meetings or Children's Hospital, or my mother working for the Recording for the Blind. And so I saw that, and that was kind of in my head. But really, I got involved when my son almost died from a near fatal brain aneurysm when he was 7 years old, and Children's Hospital saved his life. And I remember driving at night to the ICU to see how he was doing. And driving home, I said to myself, I pledge to do whatever I can to help that hospital. And so in 1999, they asked me to be on the board, and I'm still there. And now, but beyond that, and it's a very special place. And fortunately, I hope none of you have had to experience that. But as a grateful parent, it's pretty amazing. The other thing that's close to my heart lately, for the last couple of years, has certainly been the Women's Foundation, and primarily for my daughter. And what's going to happen to my daughter growing up in a world which, as we all know, is not fair to women, and certainly women's issues and economic issues for women. And so that's been a big important thing for me, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Ann Hinkins. I'm a CPA by trade. I'm also an auditor. My practice is 100% in the nonprofit sector. So I get asked the question, quite often of, you get to work with all these wonderful, and I do. I get to work with wonderful clients in a spectrum of all nonprofits, however they, touch, and I think they're all wonderful. When people say, what do you do with your time? I have to say it started out kind of being, I was an editor of my school newspaper in high school. I had a dad who was very adamant about listening to classical music, and parents that were news junkies. And I went to DU, which is where CPR started. And again, I kind of through that process sort of began, especially starting out in my career, it's, a CPA is a hard career with lots of hours. And it was really refreshing to drive home no matter what time, turn them on, and the same voices and the same things and the things that I could learn that I didn't even know I didn't know, and that I was even remotely interested in. And I still feel like now when I talk to people, I maybe don't tell them all those stories, but I tell them, for me, public media has a special place. I have been CPR has been an audit client for me, and I've been able to be on the board, and it meant the world to me to do something that I loved so much. I really think then when you think about who's going to lead Colorado's, lack of news when we don't have major papers and we don't have major news sources, CPR has been a very bold leader, and it was a privilege to be able to be with them when they started making the steps they made as Stuart came on board as the CEO. We had a strong board, a lot of vision, and it takes, I think, a lot of bravery and courage to have a great organization and say it needs to do more, and we need to take more risks to see that through and have that vision. So that's what I'm excited about.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for those comments. So let me start with the first question. One of the ways that philanthropy has really changed in recent years is how donors evaluate nonprofits. Just this idea of how do you evaluate the impact near and longer term. What do you have to show as a nonprofit from your perspectives to attract a new donor's interest? And Laura, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you. Well, I think impact and sustainability are big things, and also, as probably many of you in this room know, it's not quite as transactional as it used to be. There was, this word has been sort of hijacked, but there was often a quid pro quo that when people asked you to support something, a friend would ask you to support an organization because they were involved, and you would do that, and then they would say, well, I hope that you'll also support mine. And I think that has become, it's older school. I think especially next generation, people want more. They want to understand their impact. They'd like to be a partner in the investment. I expect the organizations that I support to be very collaborative and work with other organizations in the space to address issues and solve problems. And I just think, I think that passion for the mission is what often brings someone to you, but I think also showing people how you as an organization are making an impact, and that I think attracts and retains investors, because I think as a philanthropist, I think of myself as an investor, and you want to be an investor in a successful business with great outcomes. And I think that that's a big part of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And more investor than someone who's just writing a check to support a cause. Did you have something you wanted to add? Anne, would you like to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I would just agree with specifically, a lot of nonprofits will ask, oh, well, what if we look like we're too strong or we have too much financial support? And I always tell them it's like an investor. You want to be able to say, yes, I'm making this investment in your organization and I don't want to worry day to day if you're making payroll or you're not going to be here a year from now or 2 years from now. So I don't expect you to live off of a shoestring. And I think that's really a place that a lot of nonprofits worry, especially in the social sector, and they shouldn't. Sustainability and financial strength is important. It lets you do a lot of things, should the economy change or something else, you want to go in a different direction or expand your mission. You have that ability to do that.
And I just want to add too, I think it's oftentimes people will say, well, it's about touch. We serve X number of people. And I think it's beyond that now. It's like, how do you serve your mission? How do you deliver your mission? What are the outcomes? What happens to the people or the investments that I make? That has got to be beyond just numbers. It's like going deeper than that. What exactly are the benefits for the clients or of the organization?
Yeah, that's terrific. For those of you, if there's anyone in the back or on the side who would like to come up, we have seats, just like in middle school. We have all the front row.
Right.
It's pretty much open right here. And you're welcome to join up.
We're
join
really
us.
nice people.
Yeah, we won't hurt anybody. So some donors select a few key causes to focus on, while others are more broad-based in how they think about giving. How are you seeing donors think through this issue in terms of breadth versus focus of donations? And Ben, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to speak to that from the context of working with donors around the country, a number of private foundations and charitable folks. And I think most of the folks we work with who are still very broad-based in their giving are frustrated by that and trying to figure out how to focus. I think the ones who are finding perhaps the greatest success are the ones who are really have decided what they're passionate about. They really have become knowledgeable in that space, almost I'd say experts, and they're trying to figure out how to have the most profound impact in that space. I think of a foundation we worked with that 10 years ago was funded and decided to focus on food security. And that was it. And they've spent the last 10 years really focusing on food security and all the issues that come alongside food security. And they travel the country and they look at different programs in North Carolina and Texas and Missouri that are trying different innovative ideas, and they evaluate them and they talk with their founders and their funders to try to figure out what's working, what's not working, what's transferable, what's scalable, all that. And over the last decade, they've actually become, I dare to say, experts in food security issues. So if someone were approaching them to ask for funding from the food security space, you better know what you're doing, because they've kind of seen it all, what works, what doesn't work. And so they're expecting a certain level of competence from the folks who are executing. And then I think a lot of the things that Anne and Laura spoke to in terms of you need to demonstrate that you're doing really good work. You're actually moving the dial. It's not enough just to sort of be restocking shelves at a food bank. It's got to be bigger than that, or they're not interested. And I think in every sector, donors are just becoming more sophisticated about those issues. Another shift we're seeing, Akash and I were talking about this earlier today, and it's not universal, but we're definitely seeing an early stage, I think, wave, is more donors thinking about how they engage the community they're hoping to serve in their decision-making process, which is crossing a huge line, right? Usually there's the folks over here with resources, and there's the folks over here with problems. And the resources send checks to the people with problems or an intermediary who's going to talk to those folks. But to actually say to the people who are facing different challenges, we'd like you to be at the table to help us figure out how to most effectively allocate resources. That's a totally different kind of conversation. And I think folks are trying to figure that out. I think we're still early I think it's easier for some private foundations to do that because they have more flexibility. Some community foundations starting to take those early stages and making that a priority. And I think that's an important shift.
Do you see that trend continuing? Do you anticipate more of that?
Yes.
That's great. That's interesting. Okay, Laura, how about you?
Well, I just read National Center for Family Philanthropy study, and I think Ben's examples are really borne out in those statistics. And much like our globalization, families now live in lots of different places. So this specifically spoke to family foundations, that there's more dollars with fewer grants, and that there's been a shift of change from geographic interest to being issues-based. So you talk about going all over the country to learn about who's where are the best practices. So even in our organizations in Denver, who do you learn from? Who do you share with? It may not be another nonprofit in Denver working in our space. You might be learning from best practices in other parts of the country. And also, they said that family foundations had shifted from being the older foundations were doing more things in their community, but the newer family foundations, the shift went from the older foundations had about 28% of the older foundations were investing in the economic inequities and basic needs space. And foundations that have been founded since 2010, 64% are investing in that space. So, that's almost 3 times. And so that's really reflecting, I think, what those next generations are wanting in terms of their, and where they're making their philanthropic investments.
So the next question pertains to nonprofit boards, and you all have a lot of experience, we know, sitting on boards. And I'm curious just to know how you evaluate a board opportunity when it's presented to you, and how a leadership team at a nonprofit can engage you in a way that's kind of your best and highest use and productive for everyone involved. So Fred, I'd like to start with you with that question.
Sure. I look at 3 things. I look at the mission of the nonprofit. I look at the CEO leadership, and I look at, can I make a difference? And I think if you're going out there to appeal to board members, I think you want to look at it from the potential board members' perspective. So what I mean by mission, I think you need to be passionate, or you have to believe in what they're doing. In my case, it was certainly Children's Hospital. They saved my son's life, right? So I was passionate about that organization. And I think, and Laura was the chair of the board previous to me a couple of years ago. And I think when we go out, and we actually had a nominating committee meeting for other board members, you want grateful parents. You want somebody who's connected to the hospital. Another one for me on the mission side was, besides passion, it has to mean something in the community. They have to really be doing something and making a difference. The CEO, that goes without saying. I want somebody who's a dynamo, who's charismatic, who's passionate, who's going to really make a difference, who can move the needle. I had lunch with a CEO of an organization in town that I didn't know much about the other day. And I'll tell you what, if I wasn't so busy, I would have joined their board. Just because she was amazing. And I won't say who that is. But, and I said maybe down the road. But, so that's really important. You got to believe in the leader. And then the last one, don't join a board if you can't make a difference. My easy entree in a lot of different boards the last 25 years has just been through the investment committee. Can I actually help out the organization? And I think if you're looking for board members, see what they can do, because we all want to help, but give them something to do. I think one of the hardest things about being a board chair is, how do you plug people in? Where are they going to fit? Because the more your board members are plugged in, the more they're going to give their time, the more they're going to give their money. So for me, those are kind of the 3 things that I look at.
That's really great. And it underscores kind of the important point that it takes a lot of effort to really manage a board well, I think. And I think sometimes that is lost on some organizations, both nonprofit and public, private, is that it's a serious commitment. Anne, do you have some thoughts around nonprofit boards?
I definitely agree with Fred on that you have to have a passion or mission for the mission and really want to be involved in that. One of the things I've really learned is that you, like Fred said, you want to bring your skill set and have it used at the highest and best use. And, you know, for me, obviously that's accounting. So again, I'm kind of not on investment, I'm on the audit finance side. And, you know, at first I used to kind of think, well, you know, I may be wanting something else, but actually my highest and best use is there. So I didn't need to wander around as much as I thought. Anyway, the other piece that I really learned is that I know my business, but if I'm going to commit to go on a nonprofit board, I have to commit to know their business. And I have to learn it. And to that point about being an expert, I have to be that. And I think a lot of people want to come onto a board and then overlay their professional over what the board does, and so, or what the organization does. You know, in the Great Recession, nonprofits did not act like their for-profit counterparts. So we had board members wanting to cut back and do things when they were doing just fine. And that was really a hard thing to work through with clients and board members. And the other piece is, you know, being strategic. That's what a board does. You know, we're not there to be in the minutia. I mean, you can ask questions and you can be well informed, but really to think in a large, big picture. And sometimes, again, people bring things that they started a startup and that's kind of how they see the world. Well, that's very different in a very established, really strong organization that has a consistent, pretty high growth rate. And those are just some things that, you know, sometimes I really feel for the CEO and executive team with boards, you know, because they do have some of those experiences. And I just really think that staying in that lane is really, really important.
Great. Thanks. So our next question pertains to public-private partnerships. And we hear a lot about that. And I'm curious to know what potential you all see for public-private partnerships and any examples you might be able to give us.
Yeah, this is interesting. At first, when I thought about this question, I thought, oh my God, there's hundreds of examples. And I kept thinking about these examples and working them out and thinking, oh, which is the best one to share tonight? And then we were talking about it earlier today. And I realized actually the things I was thinking of weren't truly public-private partnerships. They were often public nonprofit partnerships. They didn't get the business community engaged. I mean, obviously, business community very generous as sponsors and at events and all that. And so did a little more digging and thought, okay, well, what's a really good example of something where folks are effectively actually engaging business in a way that's other than just getting a check and putting their logo on something, because that's a much harder endeavor. And there's a program in California called Last Mile that I thought was perhaps a really good example to share with you tonight. This isn't happening in Colorado right now, but it's spread to, I believe, 7 or 8 other states. But it's basically taking folks who are incarcerated and providing them job training. But the training is in coding. It's not in dishwashing. It's not in license plate making. It's in actually something legit that it has some value outside of the prison system. And so they work with these folks on coding, which obviously indirectly also helps bring them up to speed on other literacy skills that they didn't get. As probably many of you know, somewhere around 2/3 or more of folks who are in the system in the United States are illiterate at some level or another. So, it makes it really hard to participate. So the coding piece is really neat, but what really makes it work is that they then form partnerships with companies that hire these folks as they cycle out of the system. So that they go out, and whereas most people leave the justice system and have nowhere to go, you know, a lousy resume, obviously, but no more skills than they had going in, and certainly not any more resources, these folks have an automatic bridge into living wage and more importantly, perhaps a sense of purpose and community and engagement. The program in California, the recidivism rate at this point is 0%. That's pretty good. But I thought that was a really interesting example, and I'm finding it pushing me to think to think differently about where can we in other areas add that next step of engaging business in a way that's more than just providing the capital, but actually engaging business in a way that's actually becoming a part of the continuum of care in whatever sector it might be.
That's great. Laura?
Well, it's funny, you know, my example's private. It's not private. I was thinking about public-private partnership. Unless you say private are foundations that are investing. So they're sort of private enterprises. And I think, you know, there's been a lot of buzz around, pay for success and social impact bonds. But those are so complicated. And you think about the couple that we have in Colorado with a bunch of foundations who have invested with the city of Denver and in recidivism and the very heavy users of the justice services. And then Westminster Public Schools has, and the Sorensen Institute are really working on basically full day kindergarten. And then with the idea that the payback is that fewer kids will need the social emotional mental health service and services to get them on track as they get into sort of 1 through 5. And but those are that's a long view for those. And people and investors have to be willing to say, you know, we have the ability to invest for the long haul in hopes of those outcomes and returns. But I think that really competes with, we were talking about, what does impact investing mean? Well, I think if you asked, 10 people what impact investing meant, you'd probably get 10 different definitions, because while there is that industry in that space, different people come to it in different, with different ideas of what that means. And I'm sure many of you have experienced that with people coming, saying, and wanting to do some maybe more non-traditional work in that regard. But I think that, there's opportunities out there. With the Barton Institute for Philanthropy and Social Enterprise, we partner with the Arnold Foundation and the University of Denver and the Governor's Office and have developed the Colorado Evaluation and Action Lab, which is evaluating about 30 programs in areas that the Governor's Office has decided were priorities in the state of Colorado for efficacy and replication ability. And so that's a big partnership and impactful, but it's also it's complicated work.
I'd like to circle back on the impact investing, because I think that is one thing that comes up a lot. Just what thoughts about impact investing? What do you hear, Ben, when you're talking to clients or people out in the community who are philanthropists about their view of impact investing and how they interpret it?
Yeah, I think this is definitely one of those generational sea changes. Back when I started doing this work almost 20 years ago, the only folks who talked about the impact of their investments were in the faith community, who I was engaged with. It was very important for them to align their investments with their values, whether they were private investments or they were public market investments. I think the dramatic shift over the last decade, and it seems to keep accelerating year by year, is we're seeing more and more folks wanting to have a bigger impact with all of their resources, wanting to be more aware of the impact that their resources are having, and thinking a bit more creatively about how they help deploy capital to achieve social ends. And so whether it's private donors who obviously have tremendous flexibility, or it's more institutional investors who are trying to figure out how to steward a larger portfolio, it's almost a given that the conversation's at least going to happen. We have very few clients anymore who, if it comes in an RFP, it's not one of the sets of questions, or if they've always said, no, we're not worried about that, we just want to do the old school traditional way, now they're open to learning more. And I think part of it is post-financial crisis, folks are both trying to solve problems, so they're trying to be more creative, but also there's a recognition that capital market returns in and of themselves aren't going to move the dial on the resources available to help solve problems. And that the philanthropic sector in and of itself doesn't have enough resources to solve problems. And we could tax everyone 100%, and there's still limitations. And so when you start thinking more creatively about, well, how do we get private capital engaged? How do we get corporate capital engaged? Plus philanthropic, leverage that with government funding. And you start to really look at all of the capital as available to solve a problem, whether it's what does the new media look like, or it's what does new healthcare look like, or do we ever provide the kind of K-12 education and early childhood that we know is necessary? So I don't think this is a fad. I think that it's shifting rapidly, and both donors and nonprofits are pushing that in their own way. And necessity is going to be what keeps it moving.
That's great. Anyone else have anything to add on impact investing? Okay. Taxes. We have to talk about taxes. They obviously play an important role in philanthropic giving. We're not rolling. No one's rolling their eyes, Anne. I promise.
Anne rolled her eyes.
Anne rolled her eyes. What are you seeing from a tax perspective in terms of donors and donors and nonprofits should know? And are there any different types of structures that are more popular than others?
So obviously, last year the amount of giving kind of didn't really decrease, and that was we kind of, when we did our outlook survey with our nonprofits, really felt like a lot of donors maybe had not really looked at those numbers as tightly, that they would not maybe be itemizing. What we have seen, and we've seen a lot of growth again in donor advised funds, and now that of course is, with uncertainty, that is a place that you can say, I don't know exactly maybe where I'm going to place this, but I have a number in my mind, and I can place that either in a community foundation, I can place it with a Fidelity or Charles Schwab, I can do lots of different things. And I think from the nonprofit standpoint, that's always been sort of like they were competing, and really they're not. So one of the things that we came out and discussed last year with clients was that really, instead of just asking for a check, talk to donors about what resources and assets do you have available? Because maybe it's a donor advised fund. Maybe it is just writing a check. Maybe you could look at, rolling over an IRA. I mean, maybe you are going to be somebody who's going to be bundling, every other year, whatever those planning ideas may be. And you can have conversations about what makes sense from their passion and their availability of assets. And you can help have that conversation without feeling like, oh my gosh, they've given to this donor advised fund and now they don't have more dollars to write a check to us. And really, people get very, very concerned, but what's interesting, a lot of statistics coming out on donor advised funds still say that a lot of organizations, the donor advised funds will give up to like maybe 8 organizations. So it's not necessarily they're just giving to 1 or 2. They can give up to a multitude. Again, the big fear is, well, they're just going to sit. And again, that isn't necessarily true either. I mean, you see them moving and doing, and donor advised funds can be started at a very modest amount. I mean, it's not necessarily a 6-figure kind of piece, and donors can relook at that. I think that's really important. The other piece I really like is, when you think about it, you have a lot more months. A lot of nonprofits really feel like that end of the year, we really got to get out there and get a push. And really, you can have a whole year discussion now. The tax implication, 54% of people say that, and we get press, obviously, that anytime we want to touch a charitable contribution, the press is like, oh, nobody's going to give to a charity. Well, if you ask donors, 54% say no, we would still make that contribution. So I think we have for me, when I always get those calls in December about, I feel like I have to make these quick calculations, and sometimes it used to be under our old tax system, and especially with child care tax credits, always like a back of an envelope or, cocktail, here you go, this is going to cost you to do this, and you're saving money, and don't you feel good? And now I think it's much more to the mission or the piece that's really important, the discussion of, what are you really doing, nonprofit, and how can I help? How can I be engaged and have more engagement all through the year instead of just kind of at tax time. And so I think there's, for all things that are troublesome, I think there are flip sides that are very, very positive. So again, I would say our nonprofit clients are doing very, very well. So I don't think we've seen this big, drop off of, again, I think if they're top of class and, they're out there and engaging donors and working hard, they're going to do very, very well. And again, back to like a Colorado Gives Day, Giving Tuesday, those numbers are going to continue to rise. Every dollar does make a difference. So those people, I think, just want to be part of something bigger. And they're impressive numbers. And so that tells me, again, it's not about a tax deduction. So.
Thank you. Ben, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think I'd build on what Ann said about donor advised funds. I think one of the neat trends in the donor advised fund space is it creates an opportunity for community foundations, organizations like the Women's Foundation, for example, to think, how do we not just create a platform where people can open a DAF, because you can do that at Vanguard, Schwab,
Right.
Anywhere, but how do we add value above and beyond that? And one of the ways that I think community foundations are being more intentional around that is sharing their expertise, their knowledge of the field, or their knowledge of the region, since so many community foundations are still regional, and actually being a resource for folks who may be giving several $100,000 or may just be giving a few hundred, but to know who's out there that's doing really good work, who's actually moving the dial on the issues that are important to me. And those foundations can be a resource for that. And then we're seeing more of those foundations at least start the process of thinking, how can we enable our donors to invest in the community in a more impactful way, not just by writing checks, but by actually making investments with their donor advised fund dollars that might have a longer life because they enable things to happen today that are really good, and then that capital can come back in, really impact investing, but at the donor advised fund level. And creating a platform that individual donors may not otherwise have the resources to do. And as we see people getting more passionate about climate change, as we see people really concerned with housing, there's so many issues that can be frustrating as an individual donor because it's like, ugh, can I really move the dial on that? But when you're part of a community that's all working on moving the dial on something, it's more powerful, and it feels more satisfying too. The only other thing I'd speak to that's sort of IRS related, if you will, is, again, private foundations have to give away 5% of capital a year toward their mission. And we are seeing more openness within that community to making program-related investments, which are sort of sit somewhere between making a grant and making an investment. They often start as a way of making an investment, so perhaps offering low-cost capital. We were talking, a few of us earlier, about a capital campaign, and wouldn't it be great if a foundation would provide capital for a new building that might be lower cost than bank capital, and more importantly, maybe some of that or even all of that might be forgiven along the way. And what was an investment initially transforms into a gift, or part of it transforms into a gift. It's a level of creativity that we didn't see. I mean, people were doing this 20 years ago, but it was more confusing. There wasn't really a lot of templates for that. Lawyers and tax advisors often were cautious. But now it's almost becoming a normal part of the toolkit that at least some donors are weaving into what they do. So I think that's an important piece.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, so this is our last question to the panel, and then we'll open up the floor for your questions. And this is like a bonus round. Everyone's going to answer. Talk about an example of a personal experience with creative philanthropy. What worked and what didn't? And we'll start with you, Fred.
So in 2008, I was asked to join the Women's Foundation board, which was a little unusual. I got on the board and there were 26 board members and there were only 2 men. And one of the reasons I did it is I wanted to see what it was like to be on the other side of the coin, to be where most women, there are only 2 women on a board and there are 25 men. And so I decided to try that. And it was fascinating. I was asked because they wanted me to chair and reorganize the investment committee. So I got in there and I shook everything up and made a lot of enemies in the process. But that's how I met Ben, actually. We hired Ben as the asset consultant. So Ben and I go way back. But what was interesting was one of my goals was, how do we get more men involved in really an all women's organization? And back then, most men couldn't tell you that there was a Women's Foundation of Colorado. So after my second year on the board, we came up with this program called Dads for Daughters. And the idea was, how do we get men tricked into supporting this organization. And the best way to do that is to involve their daughters. And what father in this room who has a daughter is not going to do whatever he can for their daughter? And it was clever because now we were reaching out to men for women, their girls, and with all the issues that women face in the world and with their little girls coming up, this was going to be great. And I think if any of you have been to the Women's Foundation lunch the last 2 or 3 years, there was a video on the screen about me talking about Dads for Daughters, and I'm proud to say that we've raised $200,000 for the Dads for Daughters program in the last 2 years. So to me, that was a creative way of involving another group of people that would have never gotten involved in an organization. So, and I'm still involved, and it's really been a nice thing for my daughter and I to connect, because as she was graduating from college and hitting the workforce right during the financial crisis, it was something we could relate to. We could talk about, who are you going to interview with and what are you going to need to do to get a job? And it's been pretty special to have that connection. So
That's great. It's a great example. And if anyone can sit on a board with all women, I know you can, Fred. Okay, so Anne, how about you? Personal experience with a creative philanthropy project?
So I think I get blessed to do lots of things. One of them I did with an organization that they called me in and they wanted me to kind of help evaluate that the organization did good work. It was in the animal space. And the organization that asked me to volunteer, was hoping that I would take a look at things and kind of, they'd given grants of a couple hundred to almost 500,000. I mean, significant dollars, and that maybe we could restructure, maybe do some things. And had to really say, this isn't going to make it. This organization is not, the talent's not right. The whole economic model's not, it's really, and you don't want to say that, it's just bleeding. I mean, and it's going to be a lot more dollars to stop and, to get it to be operational. In essence, you need someone to come in and take it over almost, if you want to continue the services, it's going to be somebody else who's really in the animal space to do this. And that was the last thing that organization wanted to hear. I mean, it was like, can you rework that a little? Maybe try something else. And the people on the other side, we're just so passionate about it. And so, it has a long-standing history of like, why can't we make this work? And really kind of going through those steps. I think it's rewarding now that I've seen it was absorbed. It is now functioning like it should be. But it just wasn't meant to be on its own the way it was. So in the end, it turned out good. In the middle, in the beginning, it's really, really hard to deal with those, because it's, those are dollars you're seeing in the future. So you can't really, it's not like an audit. It's not a look back. You're living it and looking at it and doing projections that are showing this isn't going to work. And being the no person is never particularly fun. And it's really not fun when people have a lot of, history with an organization and a passion and for the mission. So I guess
It's a good example and a one that we should all keep in mind.
right.
Laura, how about you?
Well, I think probably, we're talking about what do you want as a philanthropist and investor, and I think it's about how do you leverage your impact. And so I'm currently the board chair of Constellation Philanthropy. And 5 years ago, a couple lead foundation and was trying to figure out how do you accelerate the opportunity to invest, and how do you help people figure out what makes sense? How do we do this? How do you accelerate investment into a space? And so we came up with this group, and it's a group of peer philanthropists at lots of different levels who really learn together about the early childhood development space. So the group, the members learn together and then invest together. We don't pool our money, but we come to an investment, and so someone's $5,000, $10,000, or $15,000 investment is investing alongside with other members, so you can have a really outsized impact as a philanthropist, because you're partnering and collaborating to do that. And Kate Reineman, our executive director, is actually here. And you can pick something that you could probably scale or use in any focus area, but we really decided that early childhood would be the space. And it's been really gratifying because I think just like in this room, many of us are always looking for opportunities how to learn together and figure things out. And we also were trying to not impose on organizations undue burden so they could come and pitch. So sort of a pitch session, come and pitch 20 philanthropists in a room as opposed to having some of those individual meetings and with an outcome being similar. So it's been a really a great learning journey for me as in board service, as a philanthropist, and in a space that I've wanted to learn more about and invest in for impact. So
That's a great
that's been,
example.
I think, really gratifying and a creative way to leverage what I'm able to do or our family's able to do by ourselves.
How long have you been doing that?
So we're celebrating our 5 years this month.
That's terrific.
And I think we've at least $2 million into the early childhood space. Is that
Wow.
4 million?
4 million.
Okay, I'm a little behind. $4 million. Yeah, right. No, but I mean, yeah, it's a board year. But that's pretty great, right? If you think about how do you come together and do that, and learn about what other people are doing, and leveraging that knowledge.
Yeah, I love that idea. That's great. Ben?
So mine's a little more small scale, the example I'm thinking of. But I was board chair of a nonprofit that had a founder, and it was time for that founder to move on. But that was a very difficult conversation, and we needed to figure out how to help the founder move on as gracefully as possible. Am I saying all of this with the appropriate political? It was really hard. It is hard, and I think it's one of the challenges we sometimes wrestle with in the nonprofit sector. And so came together with a very small group of donors and proposed that we basically create a glide path that included a series of opportunities for that founder to memorialize what they had created and built over the years, but also at the same time created the opportunity for them to move on. So it was sort of like, hey, I've been doing this for 25, 30 years. This is my final project. And I've captured in film and in text my legacy. So I think at many levels, trying to make it more elegant and better for the organization, truth be told too. And so we're able to get a small number of donors to come to the table and make that happen kind of discreetly because it was delicate, didn't want to make it flagrantly obvious what we were trying to do and yet wanted to be able to do it. From a challenge standpoint, it ended up taking longer. That glide path probably lasted 3 or 4 more years than it needed to. And there's a lot of lessons learned from that part of the process. But I think the core concept was still a really neat thing to have been a part of and something I'll keep in mind because I think those situations will continue to kind of present themselves along the way.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you all, panelists, for your input. We'll turn it over now to questions from the audience, if there are any. Yes, sir.
So I'm with you all regarding the, okay. Let's see if I can handle this. I appreciate all of your involvement with, social welfare issues and things like that. And I'm coming at this kind of from a place of more curiosity than anything. What about the arts? I haven't heard any of us talk about the arts, and the arts are more difficult because it's often difficult to quantify the impact that they have. But from a philanthropic perspective, we all know that the arts enrich our lives, and in fact, Colorado Public Radio has a strong arts arm. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the role that the arts play in philanthropy, and how is that changing? Because I'm involved with an organization that's doing, social welfare and venture capital, and on a very small basis, almost a microloan basis. But I'm not really very in tune with what's happening in the arts.
So I think, did you all hear the question in the back? Good? Okay. Otherwise, I'll repeat it.
There might be some expertise in the room on this, but I would say that I think arts is integrated as an important social need. And I know that even organizations that have pivoted away from making it one of their funding areas have developed affinity groups to capture and have, it's almost like a constellation, and it's a group of people who are learning and continuing to invest together. I think at the Denver Foundation, there's an Arts Alliance group. And so continue to do that. But I think, like all organizations, arts organizations have to evolve about how they engage their donors, because so much has moved from that quid pro quo and funding because it's an important community asset to how can I be engaged in this, and what's my experiential part of being an investor. And so I think that organizations are having to change to continue to capture that. But I don't know in Denver or Colorado if there's a true funding drop off. I think they're still well supported, but I think organizations have to be nimble and figure out how to change the way that they're engaging their donors. And
I know that the SCFD has a huge.
That's exactly what I was gonna say.
You know, I mean, but for the SCFD, I think a lot of arts organizations would be, or other sort of related cultural amenities would be in the world of hurt.
Well, even, oh, I'm sorry, I just even think at the SCFD level, when you think of even your largest tier ones, the abilities that they can do to bring in exhibits that I would say and change those exhibits is cutting edge. I mean, I think that's why Denver is making a huge mark that you wouldn't normally see, because they can take a little bit more of those risks, where if they had to do that all on their own, I don't think we'd be making the name that we are. I mean, to have something like the Monet caliber, a Chihuly at the Botanic Gardens, or, I mean, we have the ability to have so many more exhibits come through. The DCPA, again, the amount of, kinds of things and how they're looking to do different productions and, explore different things is really important. But even smaller organizations.
Yeah, I mean, tier 3 is amazing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's just, I'm really, really impressed how rich we are in the arts. And I think a lot of people don't know that. But to your point, I think there has to be a lot of work done on engaging younger, people that will also have that same interest in that deal and making it, how does that translate?
Ben, did you have something?
Yeah, I think in addition to accessing donors, I think a lot of the major arts organizations are wrestling with how to engage in community. A lot of our larger arts institutions are still very much destinations, and there's a sort of implied barrier that I think a lot of people feel like, well, that's not for me. That's where wealthy white people go on the weekends or in the evenings or whatnot. And I mean, we know that if you look at the major arts institutions, they are getting more usage, but I think the challenge comes back to the arts community of if people are passionate about equity and access issues and civil rights and human rights, how does the arts community do a better job of articulating its role in that, and then getting out into the community and actually being out in Elyria, Swansea, and being on East Colfax, and I think we do have a lot of smaller groups that do that, but it's definitely a two-way street. Yeah. I mean, I think actually that would be the natural place. I mean, and I think we're seeing more of that. I mean, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science is doing a lot to get out there. The zoo is doing a lot. Obviously, you can't take the animals out, but sorry, most of them anyway.
You can.
But you can actually with some of the smaller ones, and they do, and they're in schools all over the place. I think it's more a matter of really reframing their identity. I think people aren't going to donate to the arts organizations for sort of the social status that may have conveyed a generation ago. So you have to find other ways of connecting with people, and it's great that we have SCFD. I'm so glad we have it for a while. That in and of itself, we shouldn't let ourselves just assume that that's enough.
Yeah, I think I just actually was reading the Denver Art Museum newsletter, and it was experience boxes they were taking out actually to seniors, to senior communities, and thinking about a large gift that they secured that children do not pay to enter the museum. So all kids can go to the art museum for free. So I think they're, and then talking to each other about their cultural competencies and how they can be better at being on East Colfax.
Question, yes.
Hi, I'm a fundraiser for CU Boulder. And one of the questions we're wrestling with right now is to Laura, your point about one of the values and a lot of the nonprofits you invest in is their ability to sustain themselves. Part of the way that we sustain ourselves is having long-term investments from our investors. To have to go back to folks every year over and over and over again and asking them really, can you make a 5-year commitment? Can you make a 10-year commitment? And I'm curious if you're seeing any trends, especially among newer foundations or younger donors, to really go a mile deep and an inch wide and focus on an organization, but also commit over a long period of time so that they can make some of that paradigmatic systems change that would alleviate poverty, that would really move the needle to some of the things you were saying before, so that that organization can focus more on meeting its mission and less on continuing to go back and asking again.
Anyone want to take that one? Laura?
Well, I would be interested if anyone else in the room has some response to that. A couple things come to mind to me. I think about the Women's Foundation PEP program, asking for and other organizations who have asked for those multiple year commitments from donors. And not necessarily for something that's just new, but just for capacity building within an organization. And that takes the pressure off of the organization to do that. So I know as a donor, I've been approached and have made some of those investments because of that reason. I think you just have to build a case. So what is it? And sometimes you have to package something, somebody, is it the shiny penny? No, it's a strategic imperative for the organization. But craft it well.
Trig, did you have? We have a mic coming your way.
Thanks. It seems that one of the impediments to these multi-year gifts is if a person has a donor advised fund or they're giving out of their required minimum distribution from their IRA, the tax difficulties of making a commitment that's multi-year. Let's say, I'm going to give $50,000 a year from my donor advised fund to you for 5 years. That becomes a real serious problem from a tax standpoint. And I'm not even sure that I understand all the complications at this point, but it's significant because they don't allow from a donor advised fund for you to think 5 years ahead. I mean, that's verboten, okay? And it's also true that if you say, okay, I'm going to buy a table with my RMD every year for the next 5 years, all right, and the table's going to be $10,000 or $25,000. You can't do that either. So there's a lot of restrictions from a tax standpoint, I think, that do impact all this.
Yeah, certainly donor advised funds, you can't have a personal benefit, so buying a table, that doesn't work. With the donor advised funds, you're getting that tax deduction as you fund it. So then as you're bringing those dollars out, then, it is benefiting an organization, and then you don't get further tax deduction because you've already received that, so.
Yeah. You also can have them come back on you and say, this was a planned gift. Can't do that.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm on the board of the Sam S. Bloom Foundation. Some of you may remember the Downing's appliance store chain. Sam Bloom was the founder of the Downing's appliance store chain. About 10 years ago, we as a board made a decision to stop making a lot of small grants and try and experiment with focusing on larger long-term grants. So our primary areas of focus are early childhood education and family self-sufficiency. So we picked out half a dozen of our grantees, sent out an RFP, asking them what they would do if we gave them $25,000 a year for 3 years. And so we selected 3 of them. And at the end of 3 years, we brought them all together, compared notes with each other. They did a presentation to us, and then we expanded the program to where we now do 6 different organizations. We call it our Motivated Families Initiative. And we give each of the organizations $75,000. And we brought them all together this past summer, and they each did a presentation to the board and each other in the morning. We had lunch, and in the afternoon they had a round table and shared notes with each other on what they had learned, what they had gained, and it's a program that we'll continue doing because it's just proven to be very effective. And we're a small foundation. We only have a little over 10 million, but it has made a big difference, and we support organizations all over the state.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. We have a question up here. Thanks, Erica.
I actually wanted to share a comment in response to a previous question, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I serve on the board of Resource Generation, which is a national membership-based organization that organizes the top 10% of young people, so people under the age of 35 that fall within the 10% bracket in terms of wealth and income. And one of the things they're doing really effectively is organizing young people around the country to redistribute land, wealth, and power through a member-to-member model. And one of the new tools that they've rolled out in the last couple of years is a giving pledge. And so with their giving pledge, they're actually organizing members. There's over 300 that have signed it so far. They're aiming for, I think, 700 in the next few months. And people are making 5-year commitments to support social justice movements, so groups that are led by and for communities impacted by injustice. And part of how they fund their work is they ask their base to give no more than 10% of their overall annual giving in the form of a membership due, and the other 90% goes out to movement-based organizations. So by doing that, they're supporting groups like where I work, Chinook Fund, is getting some of that 90%, a piece of that. So they're not only organizing multi-year pledges for their own sustainability to unlock more resources for movements from people that have wealth that's, comes from legacies of slavery and genocide of indigenous people, but they're also benefiting grassroots groups that don't have the connections to access donors, oftentimes of that type of privilege and resource, and also politicizing them so that when they come to me, they're ready. They're so ready to give. They're ready to give generously. They're ready to be a part of something bigger, and they see themselves as much more than donors who are writing a check. They want to be involved. But they also know what their lane is as well. So if they're not a part of that community in particular, don't have that experience, they're also not trying to attach a lot of strings to their gifts. They're very humble in how they approach us and want to be a part of something, but not assuming they know more because maybe they're giving more in terms of dollars. And there is active membership here in Colorado across the Front Range. I know some other folks in the room are connected with them as well. So I think they're a really great resource, especially for younger donors that are under the age of 35.
That's really great. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, exactly. Have a seat. I want to be respectful of our time, but I also want to, this is such a great dialogue. Does anyone else have a question that you'd like to ask? One last question, yeah.
Just about
Risk.
Yeah. I appreciated hearing so much quality concern for, donors thinking of themselves more as investors, and knowing, especially in Colorado, we have so much opportunity to innovate around solutions, community-driven solutions. I'm just curious if y'all have noticed more of an appetite for risk and more of a willingness to give in a way that, the outcomes might not be trackable, or they might actually not succeed, that first couple times or several times.
More like a venture capital.
Yeah. If you're seeing any of that when we talk about shifts in philanthropy.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's always been a tension in philanthropy around risk. I think a lot of philanthropic institutions are inherently conservative. They're large asset bases, usually stewarded by folks who feel a need to protect that and not mess it up. So ironically, in a space that, and I say that as a former nonprofit founder, who was surprised by some of the folks who said no, because of the perceived risk. So I think there's always a tension in that. And, a lot of foundations want to last in perpetuity. They need to make inflation plus 5%. That's really hard to do. They want to have a maximal impact. That's really hard to do. And so I think a lot of stewards or trustees are doing their very best. But there is sort of this interesting, inherently conservative tension, not politically conservative, but decision-making, conservatism. I think there are some who are breaking that mold, and I think there are some who are breaking that mold and then trying to be examples. I've been surprised by some organizations like here in Colorado, AJL Foundation, really trying to do a lot of innovative things and being very public about what they're doing. Like they have a website, they're sharing how they're doing impact investing, they're sharing a lot of the risks they're taking, not just, it's definitely not for bragging, it's more to help build the ecosystem and be a model, including a model of what not to do, to the point where they, from time to time, might stumble and make a mistake. I think, I was in Dallas a few weeks ago with the Chamber for the Leadership Exchange trip, and one of the things that we discussed was there, I think, is still more fear than there should be within the philanthropic community about entrusting leaders of color with capital. I just think, as a white guy who went around to raise money in the early 90s, there is still a hesitation to actually trust the people in the community to be the problem solvers. I realize that's a little audacious to say, but I think that bias is still there. It's definitely still there in the banking system with loaning to small businesses. So why wouldn't it still be there in the philanthropic community when we're allocating resources? And I think that's an important thing to confront honestly. And I think it's an important next step in the evolution of philanthropy is to break down some of those barriers. So I just sense the energy shift a lot. But I mean, it's an important thing to talk about, because if we don't have that conversation, there will continue to be this divide between the folks who have capital and the folks who need access to capital. And we need to break that down. So.
Okay.
Maybe
sorry,
I'll
go
try to
ahead.
shift back around. I was going to say, when I work with my nonprofit clients and boards, a lot of things we talk about are calculated risks. Because I think there's this back to, I think you're absolutely right, Ben. There's this conservative kind of, we have this fiduciary interest. So, if we just kind of, keep expenses tight, we're growing 3 to 5%. Boy, I mean, we're building reserves. Isn't that great? When the question might be, and it seems very convoluted, but if you're doing all that well, why can't you spend more money and maybe do more of what you could really do even better? And that space may not even be covered. So, it's not like this is totally new and you're going to go off your whole path. It's known to you, and that's kind of like, and what's the worst that can happen? I mean, maybe you set some risk parameters, but again, I think that should be okay. And a lot of times boards do have very successful entrepreneurs on their boards that have owned businesses, that have done that, and they would do that in their business very readily. You just have to coach them through, like, this is doable. Yeah, I mean, like, don't, again, it's not like you're, an arts organization that's all of a sudden going to become an environmental organization. We're not asking that. We're just saying a very calculated risk, and thought about and worked through kind of the pluses and the minuses.
Great. On that, I'm going to thank all the panelists. I'm going to thank CPR and Stuart and team.